My name is Rita Slattery. I started with CSEA in 1981. I came from the New York State Department of Labor Job Service Division. So I was a CSEA member when I was hired. Of course, I had to forego being a member because I was on staff. I was hired as a stenographic office assistant in the Region 4 office, which was at that time on Western Avenue. I worked for Jack Corcoran, was the regional director at the time. He was the one that hired me. Joe McDermott was the president, the region president of the region. Michelle Agnew was the office manager at that time. It housed labor relations specialists, a few.
Well, that's all just a second.
Okay.
We're back on.
Okay.
So we left you at Region 4 headquarters.
Region 4. I was a stenographic office assistant. In 1984, the office manager decided to go that was when Romer and Featherstone Haw had split off from CSEA, and she decided to go work for them. So I applied for the job. They talked me into taking the job as the office manager, which I did. And I worked there as the office manager until 1993. I was 13 years in the region. And through that time, I saw a lot of changes. We brought in the OSH specialist that was housed in the region. We brought in collective bargaining specialists. A couple was housed in the region. I saw a lot of changes during that time. One of the changes that I was most proud of was I worked with the statewide secretary, Irene Carr, in implementing at that time it was the word processing pilot program. I was the pilot for getting other computers into the other regions. If it worked in Region 4, it would most definitely probably work in the rest of the regions. I was the pilot for that. And with the help of Irene Carr, she was such a staunch supporter of ergonomics and computers, and always she was like beyond, she was thinking beyond her years. With her help, I instituted that pilot program, and it became successful. And after that, they instituted the more computers in the work area and more in the regions. And without her help, I couldn't have done it. She gave me everything that was necessary to get that, the help, the guidance, everything. I couldn't have done it without her. In 1993, I had gone through a lot of changes in the region. My regional director, who I learned a lot from, Jack Corcoran, had gone to, I believe it was the Employee Benefit Fund as an assistant director over there. Joe McDermott had moved on to executive vice president in our headquarters office. So I was like sort of left there with different region directors. I had gone through, I had Paul Birch as a region director. I had Paul Obermeyer as a region director. It was like this transitional thing where they couldn't find the right person for the job. At that time, Al Mead also, when Joe McDermott left, Al Mead was the region executive vice president. He moved up as president. After Mr. Obermeyer and Mr. Birch, they appointed a labor relations specialist that I had worked with and done work for all those years to the regional director position, Joseph Bakarian. and he and I were familiar with each other, so we made a good team. Unfortunately, Joe died very suddenly on April 1st, I think it was, at a health and safety workshop that the region was performing. And I don't think I ever got over that. It left a huge void. And even though I got another regional director was appointed after that, I think Mr. Birch came back for a while. And then they appointed another labor relations specialist from another region. I think it was Region 5, and that was Mike Jablonski. And during all this time, this transition, it was up to me and the regional president to try to keep the office functioning. It was a very trying time during those years. And I think I probably got burnt out. Mr. Jablonski and I, we just had some differences of opinion and stuff, so we didn't, although he was nice to me, it's just the support wasn't there. So at that time, I think I was burnt out, and in 1993, Joseph McDermott was now president, with Michelle Agnew being his executive assistant. And they approached me to come down to headquarters to work for Larry Scanlon, who was then the executive director, as his administrative assistant. So it was a hard decision to make. I probably, looking back on it now, probably should have taken a leave of absence and got my act back together again. But you know, hindsight is 20/20. So in January of 1993, I transferred to headquarters after being in the region for 13 years. And my heart will always be with Region 4. It always will be, no matter what. That's where I learned the most, where I grew up, and it'll always be there. 1993, I began working for Larry Scanlon. Unbeknownst to me, there was at that time, Danny Donahue was executive vice president, and Joe McDermott was president. At that time, I didn't know there was this, it was like a rift between the executive director and the president.
Do you know what that was about?
No, I don't. I didn't want to know either. But I know I sort of got put in the middle of it, unbeknownst to me. I liked Larry a lot. He was very nice to me. But he didn't want me either. He wanted his former secretary. So, you know, things like that happen. Yeah. It was election time again, and Mr. McDermott opted not to run for office, which left Danny running for office with his present slate of officers, Mary Sullivan, and I think Barbara came at that election. She was elected at that time, and so was Maureen Malone. During that time, before the election, they had talked about transitioning people to different positions. Larry had wanted his former secretary, so that left me, where am I to go? That's when, it was in 1996, I became executive secretary, I believe at that time, in the executive offices, working for the executive vice president and the assistant to the president. And at that time, Danny won his election, and he named his secretary, Kim Heiko, to the position of office manager, assistant to the president. Unfortunately, in November of that year, Kim reached an untimely death, and there was another void, another loss for us. It was really hard. So Danny had asked me, and he asked all of us in the executive offices, the clerical staff, if we would consider being his assistant in Kim's place. At that point in time, I felt that I hadn't been there that long, even though I knew the history of the organization. I just wasn't comfortable enough to take the position, so I didn't take it. And he reached back and got his, what was she? I think she was Joe McDermott's secretary during his reign, Kelly Garceau. So she was named office manager to Danny. And so I worked for Mary, and Danny brought in when McDermott left, I'm kind of jumping around here, when McDermott left and Danny took over, he put Michelle Agnew in the Employee Benefit Fund as an assistant director up there. He then brought in Marty Langer, who was our mental hygiene consultant. He worked with us for a while. He lived in Rockland County, and the trip was like a lot for him. He was making that trip every day. And he stayed a few years, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, and he decided that it wasn't for him. It was then that Danny named Terry Melvin as his executive assistant. So I worked for Terry and Mary for a few more years. Brought us up to like 2001. It was just last year. Danny promoted Kelly, his office manager, to, again, that assistant to the Employee Benefit Fund. And Danny then asked me if I would move over into her position. And I felt I had been doing a lot of the job by then, and I felt more confident, and that's when I moved over as office manager, assistant to the president. And I spent the last 6 months as working directly for Danny, overseeing, managing the office, and that's where.
Okay, so you must have some good stories about Danny.
Well,
He told you down there to tell stories, so I want to hear some.
Danny, when I had the opportunity to be his assistant the first time, I thought, oh, I don't know if I can even work with him. He doesn't seem to be all that, have all his stuff together. He's very disorganized. I don't know if I can do this. And that was one of the reasons, honestly, that was one of the reasons why I really didn't take the job the first time. So when I did finally get into that position and I started working for Danny, he is the nicest, sweetest guy, very disorganized. I mean, you got to read to him, you got to tell him where he's going, you got to have maps to where he's going, you got to have everything, you know, and I tend to be a little bit on the too organized side. So with Danny being so disorganized and changing his schedule from one time here and next time he's flying there, and you never know where he's going to be from one minute to the next. It was very frustrating to me in the beginning. But he's such a likable person. He has that one-on-one personality. He wants you to tell it like it is. He's very honest. I don't really have any bad stories for him, except I know one time somebody put him on a trip, and it wasn't me. He thought he was in Charleston, South Carolina, and he was in Charlotte, North Carolina, or vice versa. He was not happy. But Danny, it takes a lot for him to get really upset. He lets his managers manage. He's very good like that, and he's about the easiest that I've had to work with. I really enjoyed the last 6 months with him.
That's good. It's good to know. Any stories about anybody else that we should know? Sounds like you do.
Well, Mary's a little bit tough to work with. I worked for her for probably about 6 years. And I knew Mary before. When I was in the region, I didn't know her all that well. Mary has knowledge of the organization like you wouldn't believe. She remembers things that she would be a good candidate to get to interview. But she is very hard to work for. Some days she comes in, she's happy-go-lucky. Other days, things bother her. Everything bothers her. So she was a little bit tougher to work for. But I did manage to stick it out until even working for Danny, I still worked with the officers too. So it was a learning experience.
Did you ever work closely with Dan Campbell?
Yes, I did. I worked with him when I was in the region. He was a communications associate.
He was there a long time.
Yeah.
He got to a lot of people.
Yes, he did. We used to bother him over some of the things that he would do. But he would come back. He'd always have an answer, And he and I used to do his work when I was first there, his typing. Of course, in the communications field, the typing is a little bit, you don't capitalize certain things, and I couldn't get it through my head. And every time I wanted to capitalize it, he would come back and say, no, you don't capitalize this, and like president, and so it was an ongoing battle with Dan and I. But it was all in fun. He was a good guy. He's very family-oriented, and his family and his church, and you couldn't ask for a nicer guy.
I worked with him a lot because they did commercials and he helped us with and things. So, any other stories about any of the people that you mentioned, or anything you care to tell? Because we're here, and this is the time to do it.
I remember the one time, I have more stories, I think, about the region than I do about headquarters, because that was my whole life for 13 years. And Jack Corcoran, he was a bit like Mary in the respect that he had so much knowledge about the organization. I think he and Joe McDermott kind of like were the first. I think the Region 4 office was the first regional office when they started branching out. When headquarters started branching out to the regions.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
Weird.
and I think he and I remember Michelle always telling me that when they started, they had just a small office, and it was just the three of them, and that's how they started. But Jack was a storehouse of information, and he was, you just had to know Jack to appreciate him. He was very cutting in his remarks, he could be. He was up one day, down the next. You never know what mood he'd be in. But let me tell you, you better know how to take shorthand, and that's when we took shorthand back in those days. I did all my work by doing shorthand. He dictated all his letters. I remember one time I was going on vacation, and I was the office manager at the time. And he always had this thing about saving all his work until the day before you would leave on vacation. So you'd have to rush around at the last minute and get everything together and get all your letters out and everything. Well, it just happened that the day before my last day, I was at home and I cut my thumb on a tin can, and it needed 6 stitches. Well, when you cut your thumb and have 6 stitches in, you come in the next day and you can't take shorthand. He was not happy. He was so mean to me for the next month after I came back because he thought I did that on purpose. That's my Jack. But you loved him anyway. And then one other time, we were moving furniture around in the region. And I don't exactly know how it happened, but one desk was bigger than another desk. And of course, all the field reps, as they were called at that time, wanted the bigger desk. So Jack had given it to John Cummings, who was the field rep at that time. And because they were all fighting over, John's getting the bigger desk, he's been here the longest, he's getting the bigger desk, Jack went in and had it cut off to the same size as the other desk. That was Jack.
That's a Solomon story, that's good, I like that. Well, let's get to the big questions here. What are you most proud of in your time with CSEA, what CSEA has done?
I'm most proud of having the ability to start practically from nothing. I mean, I was just a little country girl. I just moved to Albany, it's a big city, came to work for CSEA, and I kind of had the chance to move up the ladder, so to speak, for somebody that I never had much education. It was just my work ethic that put me through the ladder, so to speak, and I ended up being the president's office manager and secretary to the president.
Yeah, I think that says a lot about CSEA,
Mhm.
about the way they work.
And they gave us an opportunity to do that, and like with the help of other people, like Irene Carr, Joe McDermott, even Jack Corcoran and Mary Sullivan, Danny Donahue, all of them. I couldn't have done it alone, but they saw the potential there, I believe.
That's good. So what do you think about CSEA's future? And what does the past tell us about the future?
The future with CSEA, I think people need to be more proactive rather than reactive. They need CSEA's computer technology, for example, is still quite outdated, and they need to come to the 21st century. I think they need to know they're aware of certain things that are going to happen in the next couple of years because we've talked about it, like the state contracts coming up. What's Pataki going to do? Is he going to lay off more people? What's going to happen? They need to get ready for that. They don't need to do it. I find that CSEA, they're crisis oriented. They'll do it right there when they're in crisis mode, and they operate the best in crisis mode. They don't look to the future to try to stop some of that.
Interesting. Well, that's a good lesson. Maybe they'll learn. Maybe they'll watch the tape.
Maybe.
Anything else you want to tell us before we?
No, I've just enjoyed, like I said, I've enjoyed my days with CSEA, and I think, the organization has been good to me.